The harsh voice of Victoria reverberated through the grand foyer of the sprawling Bel Air estate like a sudden clap of thunder, and every single syllable struck Claire and Ivy with the stinging force of a whip. Standing in a perfectly aligned row opposite the two young women was the entire household staff of the Miller mansion, consisting of the private chefs, the landscape architects, the chauffeurs, and the other housekeepers. 23 pairs of eyes were rigidly fixed upon the identical twins, some filled with profound pity, others gleaming with morbid curiosity, yet absolutely no one possessed the necessary courage to step forward and defend them against the wrath of the future lady of the house. "I placed my complete trust in you two," Victoria continued to sneer, aggressively pacing across the imported Italian marble floor, her sharp stiletto heels echoing with a menacing click-clack that filled the tense silence of the room. "I treated you as if you were my own flesh and blood, and this is exactly how you repay my boundless generosity, by heartlessly stealing the priceless heirloom jewelry that belonged to my future mother-in-law." Ivy felt a sudden, terrifying weakness in her knees, and despite being 27 years old, she felt entirely like a helpless, abandoned child lost in a terrifying nightmare she could not wake up from. Standing firmly by her side, Claire clenched her fists tightly, desperately fighting back the welling tears with a level of stoic dignity that her sister had always considered to be absolutely superhuman. "We did not steal a single thing from this estate, Miss Victoria," Claire stated clearly, her voice managing to remain remarkably steady, even though her lower lip trembled slightly with contained emotion. "We have been working faithfully in this beautiful house for 3 long years, and not once have we ever laid a single finger on anything that did not rightfully belong to us." "Oh, is that so?" Victoria mocked, her face twisting into a cruel, blood-chilling smile that made the surrounding staff members instinctively hold their breath in anticipation of the impending disaster. She snapped her manicured fingers sharply, and George, the head butler, who was 62 years old, stepped forward with his head bowed deeply in shame, carrying an open velvet box in his trembling hands. Inside that luxurious box, catching the bright light of the massive crystal chandeliers above, rested a breathtaking emerald necklace and a matching pair of dazzling diamond earrings. These incredibly valuable pieces miraculously appeared early this morning, and would you care to guess exactly where they were cleverly hidden? Underneath the mattress, in the tiny servant quarters that you two girls share, Victoria declared triumphantly. A shocked murmur rippled through the assembled line of frightened employees as Claire and Ivy immediately turned to look at each other, communicating volumes through that unique silent connection that only identical twins truly understand. In that fleeting second, both sisters realized the exact same horrifying truth. Someone in this massive house had maliciously betrayed them, deliberately planting the stolen jewelry in their room to guarantee their absolute ruin. "That is a complete and utter lie," Ivy whispered brokenly, unable to hold back her tears any longer as they finally spilled over her pale cheeks and fell silently to the marble floor. "Someone deliberately placed those items in our room to frame us, because we would never even dream of setting foot inside the master bedroom without explicit permission. And you actually expect anyone here to believe your pathetic excuses," Victoria hissed, stepping so uncomfortably close that Ivy was overwhelmed by the nauseatingly sweet scent of her excessively expensive imported perfume. "You are nothing but a starving orphan who came to these gates begging for scraps of charity, so of course you reverted to your true nature and stole from the hands that fed you." The cruel insult hung heavily in the tense air like a cloud of toxic poison, but before Victoria could continue her relentless verbal assault, the massive double doors of the drawing room swung open with immense force. Alexander Miller strode purposefully into the grand foyer, his tall, imposing silhouette framed perfectly by the bright California sunlight streaming through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows. At 38 years old, Alexander was widely recognized as one of the wealthiest and most influential men in the United States of America, commanding a vast empire of luxury real estate, exclusive hotels, and massive construction firms that stretched from Los Angeles to New York. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored midnight blue suit, and his handsome features, which were usually maintained in a state of calm, calculating control, now displayed a rare mixture of deep confusion and visible irritation. "What on earth is going on down here?" Alexander demanded, his authoritative voice instantly commanding the attention of everyone present in the massive room. I could hear this senseless screaming all the way from the west wing of the estate. "And I demand to know the meaning of this ridiculous disruption." "My darling," Victoria immediately changed her tone, miraculously producing crocodile tears as she rushed toward him, throwing her arms dramatically around his neck like a terrified victim. "It is absolutely dreadful, my love. These two wretched maids have stolen your late mother's most treasured jewelry, and we found all the missing pieces completely hidden underneath the mattress in their bedroom." Alexander frowned deeply, his intense gaze shifting slowly over to the two trembling sisters whom he knew quite well, especially Claire, whose gentle presence he had spent the last several months desperately trying to erase from his complicated mind. "Is this accusation entirely true, Claire?" he asked softly, speaking directly to her while deliberately ignoring the theatrical sobbing of his wealthy, ambitious fiancée. "No, sir," Claire responded instantly, refusing to break eye contact with the powerful billionaire, as she spoke with unwavering conviction and heartbreaking sincerity. "I swear to you upon the sacred memory of our deceased mother that we never touched those beautiful jewels, and someone in this house is actively trying to destroy our lives by framing us for a crime we did not commit." "Please," Victoria interrupted with an exaggerated scoff, tossing her dark hair back in sheer disbelief at the audacity of the maid's defense. "Are you seriously going to take the pathetic word of a common servant over the absolute truth presented by your own future wife?" The heavy, suffocating silence that followed seemed to stretch on for an absolute eternity, as Alexander stood completely frozen, his brilliant mind desperately trying to reconcile the conflicting narratives presented before him. Deep down in his core, an undeniable instinct whispered that something was terribly wrong with this situation, because Claire simply did not possess the dark, greedy soul of a petty thief. In the 3 years they had lived under his expansive roof, not a single penny had ever gone missing, so why would they suddenly decide to orchestrate such an incredibly clumsy and obvious robbery? However, Victoria was staring at him with a demanding, expectant gaze, and the overwhelming pressure of his elite social standing forced him to make a swift, definitive decision. "I want you both to pack your belongings and leave the premises immediately," Alexander finally stated in a low, unwavering voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation or argument. "I do not want any messy public scandals today, so I will not involve the local police or file any formal criminal charges, but you must completely vacate this property before the sun sets." Claire stepped forward bravely, and for just one fleeting, agonizing second, her expressive green eyes locked onto his, transmitting a profound depth of sorrow and a hidden, unspeakable secret that instantly caused the billionaire's racing heart to skip a painful beat. "Please," Alexander added softly, aggressively tearing his gaze away from her haunting face because he could not bear the emotional weight of her stare. "Not make this dreadful situation any more difficult than it already is." Victoria smiled a wicked, victorious smile, safely hidden behind her manicured hands and completely fake tears, reveling in the absolute success of her ruthless, perfectly executed scheme. She had successfully manipulated the circumstances to permanently rid herself of the two most dangerous threats to her carefully planned future as the undisputed queen of the Miller Empire. What absolutely no one in that grand room knew, except for Victoria herself, was the truly terrifying and deeply personal motive that drove her to so desperately need the twins removed from the estate forever. The twin sisters quietly retreated up the hidden servant staircases for the very last time, entering their modest living quarters to gather the few humble possessions they had managed to acquire over the past 3 years. "This entire nightmare is Victoria's doing." Ivy sobbed bitterly, angrily wiping the hot tears from her face as she roughly tossed her meager clothing into a deeply worn leather suitcase. "I saw the pure, unadulterated hatred in her eyes just last week, and I know for an absolute fact that she orchestrated this whole disgusting charade to ruin us." "Be quiet, Ivy," Claire interrupted in a hushed, terrified whisper, nervously glancing toward the closed wooden door, as if the walls themselves possessed ears that would report their conversation back to their enemy. She despises us, but complaining about it now will not change our current reality. We must simply gather our pride and leave this place without giving her the ultimate satisfaction of seeing us completely broken. 3 years prior to this tragic expulsion, on a bitterly cold and relentless winter morning, 2 desperately hungry and shivering young women had knocked on the towering iron gates of the Grand Miller estate. Claire and Ivy had been tragically orphaned at the tender age of 24 after their hard-working mother, Rose, succumbed to a severe bout of pneumonia that proper medical care could easily have cured. Left completely alone in the massive, unforgiving sprawl of Los Angeles, they had begged George the butler for any sort of menial labor, promising to scrub floors and wash dishes from dawn until dusk, in exchange for nothing more than a safe roof over their heads and warm meals. Eleanor Miller, Alexander's deeply compassionate and elderly mother, had taken one look at their honest, frightened faces and immediately ordered the household staff to take them in and give them permanent positions. The twins quickly became an indispensable part of the invisible, hardworking machinery that kept the colossal California mansion functioning with absolute, flawless perfection day in and day out. Eleanor developed a profound maternal affection for Claire, frequently calling the young maid into her luxurious suite to read classic literature aloud and provide much-needed companionship in the lonely, echoing halls. When a vicious and aggressive cancer slowly began to consume Eleanor's frail body, it was Claire who remained faithfully by her bedside through the darkest, most agonizing hours of the night. Alexander, who was constantly traveling across the nation to manage his booming construction business, watched in silent awe as this humble, beautiful servant provided his dying mother with a level of pure, unselfish devotion that his immense wealth could never possibly purchase. When Eleanor finally passed away peacefully in Claire's gentle arms, Alexander had broken down completely in the dimly lit hallway, thanking the young maid through a torrent of uncontrollable, grieving tears. From that shared moment of profound, devastating sorrow, an intense, forbidden connection blossomed between the lonely billionaire and the empathetic servant. Quietly defying all the rigid, unspoken rules of elite American high society. During a particularly violent and rare Los Angeles rainstorm, the boundaries between them dissolved entirely, leading to a single, incredibly passionate night that forever altered the trajectory of both of their complicated lives. However, terrified by the overwhelming social implications and the heavy burden of his family legacy, Alexander Cowardice pushed her away shortly afterward, announcing his strategic, loveless engagement to the socially prominent but financially bankrupt Victoria just weeks later. Claire completely understood his cruel rejection, silently burying her shattered heart and resuming her invisible duties. But fate had already set a massive, irreversible complication into motion within her own body. Exactly 2 months prior to the fabricated jewelry theft, Claire had suffered through severe morning sickness and quietly confirmed her terrifying suspicions with a cheap plastic test bought secretly from a distant downtown pharmacy. She was pregnant with Alexander's child, a monumental secret she intended to carry to her grave to protect him from ruin, completely unaware that Victoria had maliciously dug through the trash, discovered the test, and immediately plotted to destroy the pregnant maid before her growing belly could ever expose the truth. The rundown, miserable boarding house they finally managed to secure was located deep within the forgotten, impoverished heart of East Los Angeles, feeling miles away from the manicured lawns and endless wealth of Bel Air. The decaying brick building possessed peeling wallpaper, drafty windows, and a permanent, deeply unpleasant odor of damp mold and absolute despair that clung stubbornly to every single surface. This terrible place is only temporary, Claire tried to assure her sister with false optimism on their very first day, carefully hanging a small, faded picture of their deceased mother on a rusted, crooked nail in the wall. "We are incredibly hard workers, and we will easily find employment in another respectable household within the week, so please try not to worry too much about our current surroundings." However, the agonizing weeks dragged on endlessly, and the desperately needed employment never materialized. primarily because the wealthy socialites of Los Angeles demanded impeccable references from previous employers. Victoria had viciously ensured their total destruction by intentionally spreading malicious, exaggerated rumors throughout the elite country clubs and charity galas, explicitly labeling the beautiful twin sisters as dangerous, deceitful thieves who had robbed the Miller family blind. The devastating slander traveled faster than wildfire, resulting in door after heavy door being slammed forcefully in their tired faces the moment they dared to mention their previous employment, Bel Air Estate. Forced into desperate survival mode, they took grueling, under-the-table jobs, washing dishes for 12 hours a day in sweltering restaurant kitchens, barely earning enough loose change to pay their weekly rent and afford a single daily meal. Tragically, the harsh conditions and the endless physical exhaustion quickly took a devastating toll on Ivy's fragile health, starting as a dry, persistent cough that aggressively evolved into something much darker. Claire would tenderly cover her shivering sister with every threadbare blanket they owned, frantically placing cool, damp cloths on her burning forehead while she struggled to breathe in the freezing, poorly insulated room. When Ivy began violently coughing up specks of bright red blood, Claire rushed her to an underfunded, overcrowded public clinic, spending the very last of their precious savings on a brief consultation and a small bottle of cheap antibiotics. The exhausted, overworked doctor warned Claire that her sister was suffering from severe pneumonia and absolutely required extensive rest, highly nutritious food, and a warm, dry environment, or else she would not survive the bitter winter. Returning to the freezing boarding house with a heavy, shattered heart, Claire suddenly felt an overwhelming wave of severe dizziness and was forced to lean heavily against the rotting wooden doorframe to avoid collapsing. Automatically, her trembling hand drifted downward to gently cradle her slightly rounded stomach, fiercely protecting the innocent, 4-month-old life growing silently inside her amidst all this surrounding darkness. In the dead of the freezing night, as Ivy struggled to draw oxygen into her failing lungs, the sick sister managed to open her feverish eyes and noticed Claire quietly weeping by the drafty window while gently stroking her belly. In a sudden flash of profound twin intuition, Ivy understood everything without needing a single word spoken aloud, gasping through her ragged breathing as she asked her sister if the child belonged to the powerful billionaire who had so mercilessly discarded them. "Yes, it is his child," Claire finally confessed between agonizing, body-shaking sobs, completely exhausted from carrying the massive, terrifying weight of this monumental secret entirely on her own for so many months. Victoria found out about the pregnancy and deliberately framed us to permanently remove me from the estate, ensuring that Alexander would never, ever discover that he was going to be a father. Ivy ignored her own severe physical pain, slowly dragging herself out of the freezing bed to fiercely embrace her weeping sister, aggressively wiping away the falling tears with a surprising burst of protective strength. "You are not alone in this fight. We will survive this terrible nightmare and raise this beautiful child together, naming the baby Matthew if it is a strong boy, or perhaps Eleanor if it is a precious little girl." Meanwhile, back in the sprawling, immaculate halls of the Bel Air mansion, Alexander sat alone in his expansive, dimly lit study, nursing a glass of expensive bourbon while a profound sense of overwhelming emptiness gnawed aggressively at his soul. Ever since he had banished Claire from the property, the massive house felt terrifyingly cold and utterly devoid of the genuine warmth and gentle kindness she had always provided. He could not stop dwelling on the heart-wrenching look of profound betrayal she had given him on her way out, and a small, persistent seed of terrible doubt began to take root deep within his analytical mind. Unable to sleep, he quietly descended into the basement security room in the middle of the night, determined to review the surveillance footage from the exact morning the priceless jewelry had supposedly been stolen by the maids. Staring intensely at the glowing monitors, Alexander skillfully navigated through the digital archives, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribcage as he watched the empty, silent corridors of the mansion play out in black and white. Suddenly, at exactly 17 minutes past 4 in the morning, a slender, elegant figure wearing a flowing silk robe emerged from the shadows. creeping silently down the hallway, leading directly toward his private locked study. The surveillance camera's resolution was slightly grainy, but Alexander instantly recognized the distinctive, confident walk and the cascading dark hair of his beautiful but deeply treacherous fiancée. He paused the footage, zooming in on the glowing screen as a sickening wave of absolute horror washed over his entire body, completely paralyzing him in the cold and comfortable metal chair. Victoria had lied to him. She had orchestrated the entire despicable robbery, and she had manipulated him into throwing two completely innocent young women out into the unforgiving streets of Los Angeles without a single penny to their names. He turned off the security monitors with fiercely trembling hands, absolutely disgusted by his own blind gullibility and deeply terrified of the catastrophic damage his foolish, cowardly actions had inflicted upon the woman who had cared for his dying mother. However, the blurry video footage was not nearly enough concrete evidence to publicly destroy Victoria's ironclad reputation and break their highly publicized engagement without triggering a massive, damaging societal scandal. He needed undeniable proof, a solid confession, or a physical piece of evidence to fully expose the true depths of her malice before he could begin the arduous journey of finding Claire and begging for her forgiveness. The following morning, after ensuring Victoria had departed the estate for an extended luxury shopping trip in Beverly Hills, Alexander immediately summoned George the butler into the privacy of his sprawling mahogany-lined study. "George, I desperately need you to be completely honest with me," Alexander demanded softly but firmly, gesturing for the elderly, loyal servant to take a seat across from the massive desk. "During the 3 years that Claire and Ivy worked in this household, did you ever, even for a single passing second, suspect them of being capable of stealing anything of value from my family?" The old butler swallowed hard, nervously twisting his uniform cap between his wrinkled hands, heavily burdened by the immense, crushing guilt that had prevented him from sleeping peacefully ever since the twins were unjustly fired. Those two beautiful young ladies were the most honest, hard-working souls to ever grace this magnificent property, and I never believed they stole those jewels for a single minute, George confessed, his voice breaking with deep emotion. "Then why on earth did you remain completely silent while I cruelly banished them from my home?" Alexander asked, desperately trying to keep his surging anger under strict control while demanding answers. "Because I am a cowardly old man with 5 young grandchildren to feed, and because I personally witnessed Miss Victoria sneaking out of this very study carrying a silk-wrapped bundle in the middle of the night," George admitted tearfully. The butler then reached into his tailored uniform pocket with trembling fingers, placing a meticulously folded silk handkerchief bearing the golden, embroidered initials of Victoria directly onto Alexander's polished desk. Armed with this damning, undeniable physical evidence, Alexander immediately dismissed the weeping butler and marched straight up the hidden servant staircase toward the tiny, vacant bedroom that the twin sisters had occupied for 3 years. He desperately searched the completely barren room, opening empty drawers and inspecting the small closet, hoping to find any lingering clue regarding their current whereabouts in the massive city. While frantically checking the wooden slats beneath the mattress where the stolen jewels had been planted, his fingers brushed against a piece of folded, slightly crumpled paper that had been hastily shoved into a deep crack in the wood. It was an unsent letter, heavily marked with crossed-out sentences and tear stains, written entirely in Claire's distinct familiar handwriting and addressed directly to him. Alexander unfolded the fragile paper with heavily trembling hands, slowly reading the desperate, heartbreaking words that Claire had poured out onto the page, but had never gathered the necessary courage to actually deliver. She wrote about the profound beauty of their single, stormy night together, insisting that she wanted absolutely none of his immense wealth and would never intentionally disrupt his highly anticipated high society wedding. But the final devastating paragraph completely shattered Alexander's entire world as Claire revealed the terrifying truth that she was pregnant with his child, promising to disappear forever and raise the innocent baby entirely on her own. The piece of paper slipped slowly from Alexander's numb fingers, fluttering silently to the hardwood floor as the incredibly powerful, Stoic billionaire collapsed onto the small, empty bed and openly wept like a heartbroken child. He possessed a child, an innocent unborn baby, and he had callously thrown the pregnant mother out onto the dangerous streets, permanently branding her as a common criminal in front of the entire household staff. That same evening, Alexander called his fiercely loyal, highly trained chief of security, Richard, directly into his private office, handing the ex-military man a photograph of the twin sisters. "I need you to utilize every single resource at our disposal to locate these two women immediately," Alexander ordered with a terrifying intensity burning in his dark eyes. "Check every single boarding house, public hospital, charity shelter, and back alley clinic in this entire massive city. But you must find them quickly, because every second they suffer is a direct result of my unforgivable ignorance." 3 agonizing days later, Richard returned to the Bel Air estate with a deeply grim, concerning expression on his scarred face, clutching a thin, manila folder containing the devastating results of his relentless, citywide investigation. "I have located them, sir. They are currently residing in a decaying, extremely dangerous tenement building in the absolute worst section of East Los Angeles," Richard reported quietly, hesitating slightly before delivering the rest of the painful truth. "The sister, Ivy, is suffering from an incredibly severe case of advanced pneumonia and lacks the financial resources for proper medical treatment, and Claire is highly pregnant, struggling to survive by doing brutal, under-the-table manual labor." Alexander felt violently ill to his stomach, instantly grabbing his keys and sprinting toward his most discreet vehicle, completely abandoning his multi-billion-dollar empire to rush blindly toward the poorest, most dangerous neighborhood in the city. The decaying tenement building smelled strongly of rotting garbage and deep despair, and Alexander climbed the dark, creaking stairs with his heart violently hammering against his ribs until he reached the battered wooden door of number 14. Standing frozen in the filthy hallway, he pressed his ear against the thin wood, listening intently as Claire spoke with incredible, heartbreaking tenderness to her sick sister, encouraging her to feel the baby kicking strongly for the very first time. Gathering every ounce of courage he possessed, Alexander knocked softly on the peeling door, and a few seconds later, the rusty chain rattled, revealing Claire's exhausted, pale face through a tiny, narrow crack. Her beautiful green eyes instantly widened in absolute terror and shock upon recognizing the powerful billionaire standing in the dimly lit hallway, and she immediately tried to slam the door shut in a blind panic. "Please, Claire, I beg of you, please let me speak," Alexander pleaded desperately, wedging his expensive leather shoe firmly into the doorframe to prevent her from closing it completely. "I know absolutely everything about Victoria's wicked betrayal. I know that you are completely innocent of the theft, and I found your hidden letter regarding our precious child." Claire stepped back, her entire body shaking violently as she protectively wrapped her thin arms around her visibly swollen belly, loudly demanding that he leave and accusing him of choosing his wealthy lifestyle over her humanity. Overwhelmed by absolute remorse and profound grief, Alexander dropped completely to his knees right there on the filthy, stained floor of the miserable apartment, sobbing openly as he begged the woman he truly loved for a second chance. Claire absolutely refused to return to the sprawling Bel Air mansion, while the venomous Victoria still resided within its walls, but she ultimately agreed to let Alexander help, solely to save her dying sister from the grip of severe pneumonia. Within an hour, Alexander had utilized his immense wealth to secure a state-of-the-art private ambulance, safely transporting Ivy to the most exclusive, highly equipped hospital in Beverly Hills, where elite doctors immediately began administering life-saving treatments. He also rented a beautifully furnished, incredibly bright apartment in a highly secure, peaceful neighborhood for Claire, explicitly promising that he would never force his way into her new life unless she willingly invited him in. For the very first time in several agonizing months, Claire was finally able to sleep in a warm, comfortable bed, secure in the knowledge that her sister was receiving world-class medical care and her unborn baby was completely safe. Returning to his massive estate with a heart completely hardened by righteous fury, Alexander purposefully strode into the grand drawing room where Victoria was happily twirling in front of a massive mirror eagerly trying on wildly expensive imported wedding dresses. The sudden, icy coldness radiating from Alexander's sharp gaze caused the incredibly tense seamstresses to quickly pack up their delicate sewing supplies and nervously flee the room, leaving the engaged couple entirely alone in the massive space. "There will absolutely be no wedding, Victoria," Alexander stated with a terrifying, deadly calm, watching with immense satisfaction as the arrogant, triumphant smile slowly melted entirely off her perfectly manicured face. "I want you to pack your belongings and completely vacate this property by midnight, because our engagement is permanently broken, and I know exactly what you did to those innocent women." Victoria attempted to laugh off the serious accusation, desperately maintaining her facade of sweet innocence, while insisting that the maids had obviously lied to him in a pathetic attempt to extort his massive fortune. Without uttering another single word, Alexander pulled out his mobile phone, playing the crystal-clear security footage of her sneaking through the dark corridors, and then firmly dropped the embroidered silk handkerchief directly onto the glass coffee table. Realizing she was completely and hopelessly cornered by the undeniable evidence, Victoria's beautiful face twisted into an incredibly ugly, demonic mask of pure unadulterated hatred and vicious, calculating malice. "Yes, I planted the jewelry to frame them," she finally shrieked, completely abandoning her sweet persona as she viciously admitted to discovering the pregnancy test and plotting to destroy the unborn child to protect her future wealth and elite social status. "You are a disgusting, poisonous monster," Alexander whispered with absolute revulsion, deeply horrified by the chilling realization that the woman he almost married was entirely capable of condemning an innocent baby to a life of absolute misery. Victoria screamed violent threats, furiously reminding him that her highly connected family would ensure a massive, highly destructive societal scandal if he dared to humiliate her by canceling the wedding so close to the actual date. "If you do not disappear quietly tonight, I will personally hand over all of this concrete evidence to the local authorities and ensure you spend the next decade rotting in a federal prison cell," Alexander countered with a voice like shattering ice. Realizing she had completely lost the ultimate battle, Victoria stormed out of the beautiful mansion, viciously swearing that she would return to exact a terrible, bloody revenge upon him, Claire, and the bastard child that ruined her perfect life. The very next morning, Alexander gathered the entire household staff into the grand foyer, standing tall on the marble staircase to publicly and sincerely apologize for his terrible lack of judgment regarding the fabricated robbery. He officially cleared the twin sisters' names in front of everyone, firmly announcing that Victoria had been permanently expelled from the premises for orchestrating the malicious crime, which caused George the butler and several others to weep tears of profound joy. With the toxic presence finally removed from his home, Alexander dedicated every single day to slowly and carefully rebuilding the shattered trust between himself and the incredibly resilient, beautiful woman carrying his child. He respectfully attended every single medical appointment, sitting nervously in the waiting rooms, completely prioritizing the health of Claire and his unborn baby over his multi-billion-dollar business empire. During a highly emotional ultrasound appointment, the brilliant Dr. Harrison excitedly pointed to the glowing screen, joyfully announcing to the tearful parents that they were going to have a perfectly healthy, beautiful baby girl. Alexander reached out with trembling fingers, gently grasping Claire's hand as he stared at the blurry image of his daughter, feeling an overwhelming surge of profound, unconditional love that completely transformed his entire perspective on life. When they left the exclusive clinic, he softly suggested naming the baby Eleanor, in deeply loving honor of his late mother, to which Claire happily agreed, firmly cementing the beautiful, healing bond forming between them. Despite the newfound peace and the joyous anticipation of baby Eleanor's imminent arrival, neither of them realized that Victoria was still lurking in the dark shadows of the massive city, secretly plotting her ultimate, devastating revenge. The highly anticipated night that baby Eleanor finally decided to enter the world was accompanied by an incredibly fierce, terrifying Los Angeles thunderstorm that severely flooded the city streets and violently rattled the hospital windows. Claire experienced her very first painful contraction, while resting in her secure apartment, and Alexander immediately abandoned a critical board meeting, recklessly driving through the torrential, blinding rain to rush her to the exclusive private hospital. Dr. Harrison quickly assessed the highly stressful situation, noting that the baby was in a dangerous, complicated position, and immediately ordered the dedicated medical staff to prepare the bright, sterile operating room for a frantic emergency cesarean section. Alexander tightly held Claire's trembling hand until the very last possible second, passionately kissing her sweaty forehead and promising with absolute certainty that he would protect their beautiful daughter with his own life if necessary. Following several incredibly tense, agonizing minutes inside the bright surgical suite, the beautiful, piercing sound of a newborn baby's loud cry finally shattered the heavy silence, bringing instant, overwhelming tears of absolute joy to Claire's exhausted eyes. However, hiding entirely out of sight in a dark, empty hospital corridor, the vengeful Victoria had successfully executed the first phase of her truly demonic plan by heavily bribing a desperate, deeply indebted nurse named Martha. Victoria had paid the desperate nurse a massive sum of cash to secretly kidnap the newborn infant during the chaotic aftermath of the surgery, intending to completely vanish with the baby and leave Alexander completely broken forever. Martha nervously placed little Eleanor into a clear plastic bassinet, falsely informing the other doctors that the baby required immediate, specialized testing in another wing, and began quickly wheeling the child toward the isolated service elevators. Fortunately, Ivy, who was waiting anxiously in the hospital hallway and possessed a fierce, protective instinct over her new niece, immediately noticed that the nervous nurse was rushing down a completely unauthorized, dark corridor leading toward the exit. Ivy screamed loudly for Alexander and the highly trained security chief, Richard, who instantly sprinted down the long hallway just as the terrified nurse violently pushed open the heavy emergency exit door to hand the baby over. Standing in the pouring rain, looking absolutely deranged and soaked to the bone, Victoria eagerly reached out her greedy hands to steal the innocent child, screaming at the crying nurse to hurry up and hand over the newborn. Before Victoria could even touch the bassinet, Richard forcefully tackled the screaming nurse to the floor, while Alexander violently positioned his large body firmly between the deranged socialite and his precious crying daughter. Alexander's fierce determination to protect his daughter brought Victoria's final scheme to an end. As police officers arrived at the hospital, alerted earlier because of her suspicious behavior, Victoria was arrested, while the remorseful nurse confessed the entire kidnapping plot. With no way to escape responsibility, Victoria faced the consequences of her actions. Overwhelmed with relief, Alexander carried his rescued daughter back to Claire, ensuring their child was finally safe. 1 year later, the Bel Air estate had transformed from a lonely mansion into a warm family home filled with love and happiness. Surrounded by loyal friends and staff, Alexander and Claire celebrated their wedding, while their daughter Eleanor played a central role in the joyful occasion. As they stood together overlooking the California hills, Alexander and Claire reflected on the difficult path that had brought them peace. Their journey proved that true strength is not measured by wealth, but by integrity, resilience, and the ability to remain compassionate despite betrayal and hardship. Although deceit and arrogance may seem powerful for a time, they eventually collapse under the weight of their own corruption. Their story showed that forgiveness is not weakness but freedom, allowing love and healing to replace bitterness. In the end, every struggle and sacrifice helped build a meaningful life, proving that lasting happiness belongs to those who choose compassion, courage, and kindness over revenge.